Hi, this is Brett Godfrey and our seventh episode of Viewpoint. Part of the purpose of Viewpoint is to provide different viewpoints on a variety of subjects to people all over the world. And today's theme will be what used to be in the old days called a generation gap. But I wanted to find a young person who's very socially aware and plugged into how current social and political and economic issues are seen by a younger generation. I guess you could call me a baby boomer, but I needed somebody that was a Gen Z or some such thing. So I brought a very special guest today. Her name is Katelin Godfrey, and it's no coincidence that her name is the same as mine. This is my daughter, and she's a very opinionated young lady. She's careful to think through what she says and thinks, and I thought it would be really fun to watch the side-by-side comparison of how I see the world versus how she sees the world. Good morning, Katie.
Good morning, Dad. Thanks for having me on your show today.
You are more than welcome. So, how old are you, Katie?
I'm 21 years old.
Now, I use that phrase Generation Z, but I'm not that plugged into these things the way you are. So, where would you really fit demographically or generationally?
I think that I am considered to be on the cusp of millennial and Gen Z, or a zillennial, born in 1999. I think that I'm more so towards Gen Z, though.
Is that a philosophy or is that just how old you are?
I think it's just how old I am, but also based on the cultural aspects that I'm exposed to and how I dress or things I think about politically.
So, it seems to me that the reason we use these labels of Gen Z or baby boomer or whatever is that we have started to stereotype the philosophical approach to life that we sort of identify with those various generations.
Right.
We're not really talking so much about age or exposure to history. You weren't alive when man first walked on the moon, and I was about 7 when that happened.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the labels are also because we have, as a society right now, we have sort of a knee jerk need to label everything. What do you think about those labels? Do they mean anything to you?
I think that they can be constructive in the way that they can help identify where exactly views differ between age groups, which is a very real thing that we're experiencing socially these days. But I think that also, if you're the kind of person that, doesn't have enough personal integrity or identity, that you can get lost in those labels and forget to seek the truth.
Well, we talked before we went on live today about various other labels and names that are used more by your generation than by mine. Uh, and some of those would be words I don't really fully understand, like QAnon and woke and things like that. Those are words that are a really common part of the lexicon of people your age. Isn't that true?
Yeah, definitely. I think that words like woke, or the idea of QAnon, and how things that are totally based off of the media and social media, the internet, are definitely more intertwined with my generation than yours.
So, as we sit here recording today, lots of different things are happening in the world. We have ever escalating tensions with Iran, especially between Iran and Israel.
Hmm.
We have some level of global instability. We always have.
Hmm.
We think today of our times as being fraught with more peril than ever before, but I just watched last night, I rewatched Saving Private Ryan, and I also saw World War II in high def on Netflix, and it kind of reminded me that the world was even more unstable back in 1939, 1940, 1941 than it is now. And we sort of think that our traumas are the only real traumas because the rest is just words in a history book. But if you focus on the way you see the world today, what do you see as the primary threats and dangers that young people seem to have their minds stuck to these days?
Well, you mentioned the perils and the traumas of your generation being the more concrete or more real traumas, and I think that the difference between my generation and the thing that we're stuck to is trying to figure out what the source of these human disasters of behavior, war, and nuclear threats and things like that that you consider to be really, really terrible to society, that my generation and what we are often seen to be more sensitive for is really trying to unpack those traumas, trying to say, breaking the cycle, breaking the generational cycle of all these pains, because our parents are these people who have so much of this idea that the world is a dark place and that it's going to be a dark place and it will remain a dark place, and that if you as a young person are going to comment or say, hey, we should fix this, I think that this is wrong and this is wrong and that this is something that we should stop doing, that your generation is more likely to say, oh, you're too sensitive, you haven't been through anything. But it's more so an idea of like, how do we break that cycle? How do we break out of it? What really went on? Why did that happen?
Do you spend a lot of time talking about those subjects with people your age?
Less so because of the current world social aspect, but
You mean the pandemic?
the pandemic and how that's affected the way we communicate with each other, which is often in Instagram images, info bites of political climate, how to think about the world, the things you should say. But I'd say more of the conversation happens online, and it's more so based around the things that you're sharing and the sort of social subsets that you're associating yourself with that make that conversation said for you, which I think can be problematic also.
Would you describe yourself as a special snowflake?
I would say that I am the specialist snowflake
And why is that?
because I don't melt.
All right. Well, you grew up with some trauma in your life, did you not?
Some, yeah.
Not to dredge up bad memories, but I want the audience and the listeners to get a sense of who you are, where you come from, not just what age you are, what generation you hang around with, but also what your life experience is included on the big picture items. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Centennial, Colorado.
And you spent some time in Hollywood, is that right?
A little bit of time in Hollywood, yeah.
About a year and a half?
Yep.
All right. With me
Mm-hmm.
and the whole family, including our long-lost, dearly departed golden retriever, Zach,
Yeah.
who was Zach the Wonder Dog in Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember one day you ditched school,
Mm-hmm.
and it turned out to be a good idea that you did. Tell the listeners what happened that day.
Well, on December 13th of 2013, a lone gunman entered my high school, fired a couple shots down some hallways, ended up ultimately killing a girl named Claire Davis. He set off Molotov cocktails in the library and burned the library black. I picked a good class period to ditch that day, but yeah, I'd say that was definitely a trauma that's very much associated with my generation, the experience of gun violence. Also, the sort of aftermath that is less considered from that sort of thing, that I consider it to be that the death toll doesn't end after the gun stops firing, in the way that 9 students since 2013 have committed suicide from my high school due to whatever traumas surrounding the area or events. So a lot of experience with death, gun violence, but also I'm a shooter, so are you. So it's a dual relationship with that sort of thing.
We have to get the audience to watch some of the trailers for the book Black Sunrise, the promotional videos, because a lot of those talk about what it is like to train hard as a combat shooter, even though you're a civilian.
Right.
And you've had a lot of training with a handgun, haven't you?
Mm-hmm.
Tell the audience a little bit about that training.
Well, I've been to a place called Gun Sight, which is one of the premier gun training schools in the world, several times. Done all levels of their handgun classes more than once. Emergency medical training there as well.
And you trained in your emergency, or what I call the combat medicine class, with a man named Steve Timmerlin, who was the chief emergency surgeon for Delta Force at one time.
Mm-hmm.
You and he really hit it off, didn't you?
Yeah, he's a wonderful guy.
and he was really impressed with you.
Hmm.
He told me you were the second best student he'd ever had, and the best guy was from SEAL Team 6, active duty. Uh, you train hard with your pistol.
Yeah.
And uh, what do you think, as a person who's highly skilled with a handgun in a combat situation, what do you think about gun control?
I think that there should be way more policies and limits in place for people who've had mental health issues, certain criminal backgrounds. It should be a lot harder for those people to get guns. But I think that the only thing I'm very much a believer of this sort of term that the only thing to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. I fully believe that. You know, if he's not killing himself with it, someone else is going to stop him, or you're going to prevent a lot of people from losing their lives or getting injured in a gun violence incident if you have a good guy with a gun to stop him first.
Yeah, I read a news story about 2 years ago where an active shooter went into a church in Texas, and there was a concealed weapons permit holder
Mm-hmm.
in the church who had training, evidently some good training. He fired a single round through the head of the assailant and stopped him cold. The gun control lobby doesn't like stories like that because it sort of frustrates their agenda. But anybody sitting in that church was probably a big fan of the guy who carried the gun into church that day because he stopped the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
You and I have talked about that story a lot. And obviously, it's one thing to have a gun in your belt somewhere or in your purse. It's another thing to know how to use it. When we hear about people who get concealed weapons permits and carry guns, but don't bother to get heavy training like you've had, what would you say to people like that?
Get the training. It's worth it.
Do you think a person who carries a concealed weapon with a permit, but has only had maybe a 4-hour class, is really safe to carry a gun?
No.
Why not?
There's a lot more aspects of training that are so crucial to back up a little bit. If you are going to have a firearm, this deadly weapon that is meant to kill people, if you're shooting a gun at someone, this idea that you're just going to shoot them in the leg and they'll stop doing what they're doing and that you're not going to kill them, you're carrying a deadly weapon. You're saying that you are going to be willing to kill somebody in the name of defending yourself or someone else. And I think that that point gets lost a little bit in the fact that 4 hours of training, or whatever this minimum level of training is to get your concealed carry, is nowhere near enough what it takes to really understand what it is that you're going to be doing, especially when the situation arises where you need to use that firearm. That's nowhere near enough.
So you're in favor of gun control even though you're an avid shooter?
Absolutely, yes.
Well, I think that you've made a good case for that, and you've got me convinced. So here we are, devotees of hardcore combat training with a pistol.
Mm-hmm.
I've been to gun sight a number of times, so have you. Why don't, just to give the listeners who are interested in this, we probably had a few tune out just because we're even talking about guns, but why don't you tell, and by the way, how old are you?
I'm 21.
All right, so why don't you tell the listeners from a 21-year-old point of view what it's like to take the most advanced class you've had at gun sight?
It's definitely something that separates me from my peers in a lot of ways. These times that I was at gun sight being not only the youngest, but also the only girl. And that is met with so much discipline and mental perseverance, but also an understanding of a certain aspect of reality that I think a lot of young women my age, don't really understand about the importance of protecting themselves. I'm grateful for my experience there. And even though guns have been a dangerous or traumatic part of my life, I still get a lot of comfort from the pistol I keep on my nightstand every night.
Well, you have gone into competitions against Tier 1 operators, trained SWAT leaders, and people that mainly do this sort of thing for a living. And I'm not going to make you brag, but I'll brag for you. I've watched you put those guys down a peg, humble them. It scares the hell out of people when a 19-year-old girl outshoots the head of LA SWAT or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you beat the head of LA SWAT, but I know your mother did, and or one of the commanders on LA SWAT, maybe not the head of it, but it was a class we took together with Robbie Latham
Mm-hmm.
a few years ago, who is probably the best shooter in history. Um, it's an interesting thing when you look at the stereotypes of men and women with guns. The first time you shot at gun sight, you had long fingernails. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
And that was a bit of a problem in the end of the day, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so we all have this idea of we don't want women in the military. When I say we, I mean old guys like me.
Right.
We used to talk. I've changed my views on this drastically after I flew with some female pilots in the Air Force. But I can tell you that at one time I thought if I found myself in a foxhole somewhere, which is not common for Air Force people, but if I did, I didn't want some soldier next to me throwing down the rifle and saying, "Damn, I broke a nail," in the middle of a firefight. And that's a stereotype, and it's demeaning, and
Absolutely, yeah.
it's unrealistic.
Mm-hmm.
Women that make it into a foxhole, which I think Israel was one of the first countries that really did that institutionally in the free world. They don't make it into the foxhole if they're that kind of a snowflake that would melt.
Absolutely, yeah.
I really like your analogy. I'm the best snowflake because I don't melt. Um, you've had a lot of challenges. What do you do now? What are you up to these days?
Well, I'm a neuroscience student at CU Boulder. I love working with children. I'm an artist.
And so, when under the heading of artist, tell our viewers and listeners what sorts of art you do.
All kinds. You name it, I do it.
So, why don't you list off a few things?
I love to sculpt. I love to make clothing. I love to paint. I love to make digital art and jewelry and music. All of it.
And you just took up the guitar, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're having a lot of fun with that.
Yes.
So you live in Boulder, right?
Yes.
So here we sit, about a month after a major shooting in your
2
town.
weeks.
2 weeks.
2 weeks, yeah.
Since the King Super shooting.
Mm-hmm.
Where were you when that happened?
I was in Las Vegas with the family that I was working for.
So you were tutoring an autistic child?
No, just run-of-the-mill children.
Oh, okay. You have experience in tutoring children with autism or Asperger's, is that right?
Yes.
And how did you get that experience?
Well, I was lucky enough to get a job at Garden Autism in Littleton, and combined with my neuroscience experience, it was just something that I really enjoyed. And it's one of those things where you need good people on the inside. So if you're a good person knocking on the door of that sort of thing, they're not so likely to turn you away.
So living in Boulder, and your apartment isn't that far from the King Supers that got shot up, is it?
No, it's not far at all.
How do you feel about that you now are living very close to one of the major mass shootings in American recent history?
It's, I find myself every single time I drive by that King Supers having this thought of 10 people being murdered in cold blood just right there by a gunman. The fact that, that ties in my sort of, memory amygdala connection in my own brain of the trauma from my high school. And I find that it can be pretty hard to process. It can be pretty hard to compartmentalize because it's one of those things that I find myself being sort of stuck between how do I respond to this emotionally? Do I grieve or do I persevere? And what's the relationship between those two things?
I'd like you to elaborate on that more.
Well, there's so many moving parts to this sort of trauma and this sort of violence in our area. And we get this comparison online, especially that other countries, other first world countries don't really have this issue, that it's kind of an American staple for gun terrorism to be a pretty regular thing. And, here I am being a person to kind of been very close to two incidents like that, like I'm sure many Americans are. And there's this there's this feeling, I think, especially in the first world culture, the culture of capitalism and the way we live our society as a student in college, where it's like, oh yeah, 10 people were shot down the road, but I'm going to need that essay by tonight still. Just the pressure from our communities and from our society as a whole to still be this ultimate version of yourself, the ultimate persevering, capitalistic, uh, for lack of a better term, kind of person, sort of cold to that sort of thing. And if you're not, I think that that's when you get labeled as a snowflake, that when you say, maybe you don't know what the answer is, but you just want people to stop being murdered around you. And you say, hey, maybe we should control guns a little bit better, or maybe we shouldn't have guns at all. That you're either labeled as a snowflake, or just like a certain type of person politically. And so it's like this, do I be the cold-blooded sort of American that I think I should be, or that I'm told I should be to really get somewhere in life, or do I sort of break down at the fact that terrorism, domestic terrorism, isn't something that's new to me? And I think that that gets mixed up a lot with this whole idea that your generation has more severe, with the different wars, that it's more severe. But as far as domestic terrorism, other than 9/11, this sort of thing, that when you were my age, nobody went into your grocery store and murdered 10 people.
Yeah, the worst thing that would happen in the grocery store where I grew up in Cheyenne, Wyoming, is somebody might shoplift. I went to a high school that scored very high nationally on academic testing, SAT and ACT tests, and two of the students in my high school class scored top in the country on the ACT. We were also Central High School in Cheyenne, Central Indians, which was a word that nobody thought had any racial component to it. It was an honor to the Native American tribe that Cheyenne, Wyoming was named after, which is the Cheyenne people. And I spent years of my life pursuing work as a lawyer representing Native American tribes. I represent the Muskogee Creek Nation right now, and I'm so proud to be able to say that. But when I was your age, I was just starting college. But if I go back to the high school times, we had some fights in school.
Mm-hmm.
It was a big deal if somebody got into a fist fight.
Mm-hmm.
I was a little guy with a big mouth, and there was something immensely gratifying about beating the crap out of Brett Godfrey.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to learn to deal with that. I either had to learn to shut up or I had to learn to fight. The shutting up part was beyond my skill set. So I had to learn to fight, and I became an avid fan of karate. I took every karate class in Cheyenne. In those days, there were 3. But, a fist fight that got hardcore was the worst thing that ever happened. We had one shooting situation where a young man from kind of the impoverished part of town he took a hunting rifle and he opened fire on the Cheyenne Police Department. And then he started shooting at the bank building next to it, which is where my dad's office was. And they happened to have a sniper from Denver giving a class at the PD in Cheyenne. And the chief of police just asked him to go ahead and take the guy out. They warned him and warned him and warned him. The chief of police knew the man's name off the top of his head because he'd seen the guy in a small town.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, he wouldn't stop shooting. He was drunk. He was about 19 when it happened. And so the head of the Cheyenne PD said, take him out. So the sniper put his rifle together and pounded around through his chin. And that was the most traumatic event at the time that had happened in Cheyenne. Nobody would walk into a school with a weapon. And if they did, no one else would say anything. Kids would sometimes put hunting rifles in their locker because as soon as school got out, they were going to go hunting.
Right.
But nobody thought anybody would ever be a weapon-based threat in my high school or anywhere else in Cheyenne. And that's not to say there was no violence. I had my next-door neighbor was killed when I was 7 in a liquor store holdup. and he was a wonderful man. And that went on to lead to several criminal trials and some very interesting history I won't go into just now. But I'm trying to underscore that my idea of violence when I was your age, before I moved out to LA to train in the martial arts, which changed everything. That reset my meter, so to speak. But my idea of violence and what your exposure has been repeatedly as you've grown up, totally different things. And as a parent, I sort of look at you sometimes and I wonder, how deep, if at all, are any permanent psychological scars
Oh, yeah.
that you've experienced trauma that I didn't experience.
There's a level of experience with death that I think that has been somewhat unique to the city that I grew up in, and also now in Boulder. But, back to this idea of kind of like the snowflake mentality and trying to address these scars that have been done to our society as a whole, that when like I said, it's not just the violence, but it's also the fact that I could name 5, 6, 7 young women younger than I, who have killed themselves just in my own little bubble. And that's bizarre. Also, these shooting situations, there's a level of losing it that is occurring. And
explain what you mean by that.
That in an insane act like shooting up a King Soopers or high school or killing yourself, it's insanity. And the amount that it's occurring in is frightening. It's disheartening. It's a very immediate threat to the future of America, the future of the world. And that's what's so toxic about this sort of boomer mentality, or even the mentality sometimes of the right, that when you're a snowflake or when you're commenting on these things that are pretty threatening to society as a whole, that we often have this desire to put other people through the pain that we went through, because even if we made it out through the other side, we're reluctant to make something easier for someone else or better for someone else, because it might somehow invalidate or make less valid the pain that we went through ourselves. And I think that's the disconnect, is that there's this idea that we all have to be on a certain level of suffering and on a certain level of being just absolutely insane, cold, cutthroat, in destruction of many things, in oppression of many people. And that because so many generations before us did it and were fine, and we're also very much not fine, that, I mean, there's a lot of moving parts to this argument, but to address these issues is so pertinent that calling people snowflakes when the attempt is being made can be so destructive.
Well, I think that's a good point you make, because we talk about the world is full of special snowflakes, and you and I have spent a lot of time hanging out with really hardcore military people, and their mindset in life is that life is hard, but you have to be tougher, and it shouldn't be a big deal. Things come along, you just have to deal with them. Maybe when they're in basic, they may have to go for a 20-mile hike with a 90-pound pack on their back, so they just learn to shut up and do it. And then they hear somebody complaining that their food doesn't taste right at Chick-fil-A or Noodles
Absolutely.
and Company. And they're like, you're lucky you have anything other than K rations, which would be an MRE today, I think.
We all do it. I do the same thing, especially with the things that I've experienced when I hear other people my age, make certain jokes or talk about certain things as if the fact that, their girlfriend texted their boyfriend, and just some sort of thing, that I have this mental thing of being like, what's the matter? No one died. Nobody died.
Yeah.
You're fine. And so I do the same thing where it's like this devaluation of someone else's experience with any wrong in the world, that pointing out something wrong or pointing out something that's not ideal has to only be a certain level of severity, or that it's only valid at that point.
Does it seem to you that people in this country are more polarized than they were 10 years ago?
I'm not
I'm
sure.
asking you to compare the socio-political and geopolitical scene today with what it was when you were 11. I realize it's an unfair question, but I'm a trial lawyer, and asking unfair questions is my job.
Well, I think that propaganda has always been something that has been very polarizing of people's, and we are more exposed and have more opportunities for exposure to propaganda now than ever before.
Do you think this country may be susceptible to the kind of polarizing extremist thought group hypnosis that allowed Adolf Hitler to inspire his countrymen to murder 6 million Jews?
Yes,
Do you fear that?
absolutely.
What do you think the solution is for that?
Education, improving access to education. A- That I don't think that we're going to stop polarizing rhetoric and imagery and propaganda from occurring on media platforms, but I do think that we can train young people and all people to be more aware of what's really going on.
From my point of view, I can tell you that I am an enemy of extremist thought. I'm an enemy of intolerance, and I am an enemy of hate speech, hate thought. I'm also an enemy of forced conformity,
Yeah.
and I'm a big fan of tolerance. When I was a boy, no one would ever come out and openly admit that they were gay. Now we have all these different shades of sexual preference,
Right.
and it's gotten to be sort of expected that that's not something you're going to pick on somebody about. Yet it happens every day.
Right.
I can tell you that getting used to that for me was a major issue. We had a case in Colorado when I first started practicing law that involved a constitutional amendment, which was called Amendment 2, that simply said gay people in Colorado would not be given any special protections over everybody else. And at first, that looked like a neutral statute, but the judge in the case at the district court level, who was trained by the same man that trained me, said, no, this has an effect of invalidating gay people, and it does, in fact, constitute a hate-based statute. And people that aren't lawyers in the audience may find this boring, but this went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court of the United States affirmed Judge Jeff Bayless, who had said this is an unconstitutional statute. When I read the Supreme Court's decision, which took me 3 hours, it affected me at a deep level. It changed my whole view of the world. And I think I was a bit of a homophobe before that, if that's still a word.
Yeah.
But when I read the Supreme Court's enlightened decision in that case, it changed me permanently. And it started me on a journey that's still in place, still underway today. But I'm 61 years old, and you're 21 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think it's wonderful to be able to, especially because I'm so proud of you, since you're my daughter, that you have your own views of these things, and you know things I don't know. You spend more time on social media than I do, although I have many social media channels for my various platforms. But the question I have for you right now is, from the standpoint of a 21-year-old, very mindful girl, how do we get this country to calm the hell down?
Well, by calm down, do you mean be less divided and extreme?
Yes, that's exactly what I mean.
I think that we're not quite to the level of division and extremism that is going to yet be reached. And that's
So
my personal opinion.
Are you saying it's going to get worse before it gets better?
I do think that it is going to get worse before it gets better, because it has progressively gotten worse over the past 4 years, where, I hear when you were talking about gay people coming out when you were younger, you use this term, get picked on. And that stood out to me because it's not that gay people are getting picked on, it's that, and this, I think this number might be wrong, but I'm somewhat sure that it's true, is that the average life expectancy for a Black trans woman is 35. That it's not that these people are being picked on, it's that they're being murdered and attacked brutally. And so with the level of division that we have in the country, of there being people who are saying, this is really weird, this is not good, this is super wrong, and this is not the kind of America that we should be, this is not the kind of world that we should have. And then the other side of people that say, well, you just hate America and you just are going to go to hell. And this idea that everything is perfect, everything has always been perfect, and you're going to ruin it for the rest of us by trying to change things around. And so I'm sure from that statement you can kind of hear which side I lean towards, but we've reached a point of division that there's no going back. There's no, hey, everybody, let's calm down and just go back to where we were, because I strongly believe that there's a fight happening. And it really is a fight between two opposing sides, and that there's going to ultimately be a winner. And just as your question about Hitler's Germany, I think that it would be very much ignorant to believe that we're not prone or subject to a similar sort of occurrence. I think that we absolutely are, and that's what's so pressing about the matter, and why there needs to be a fight in the first place. When we try and become more ignorant and calm everybody down and say, hey, we'll have this conversation later, because that's kind of what that would be.
Okay, now wait a minute. I want to take issue with you on that one. I'm not advocating that we become ignorant or numb ourselves up, like Pink Floyd would say, become comfortably numb.
Mm-hmm.
I am suggesting that we elevate the level of our brain operations to adult Homo sapiens, and that means start acting like adults. And when I look back on January 6th, when the Capitol was stormed,
Mm-hmm.
I died inside when I saw that,
Right.
because as a lawyer, to me, the rule of law is one of the absolute cornerstones of civilized society. And, lawlessness, I don't care how much somebody loved Donald Trump or hated Joe Biden or hated Mike Pence or Nancy Pelosi, I can tell you that first of all, I'm an engineer, and I've been trying to invent a time machine so that I could go back and undo my decision to vote for Donald Trump. One of the dumbest things I ever did in my life. But I didn't see it getting as bad as it got. And I think a lot of Americans are in that class. But those were people who were so stirred up that they found themselves doing something that if you asked them a year beforehand if they would ever do such a thing, an awful lot of them would say, no way. But we know the psychology of the mob. We know what it takes to whip a mob into a frenzy, and people in a mob will do things that no individual would have done. So that's part of the reactiveness of human thinking. When I look back on the fact that people died in that, that's the capital of the United States. That's the symbol of America and what everything America stands for. Yet it became a place to desecrate.
Mm-hmm.
To me, I don't think anything justifies that. And there were people there that thought this will be an armed insurrection, we'll overthrow the government, and have some new utopian thought process. But we had a revolution in this country not long before that. We had an election. And that's the way we have a built-in revolution every so many years in this country. But I personally believe that voters don't think enough about the candidates they're voting for. They get caught up in mindless sound bites. They don't look at candidates. And now it's a question of who's got the best funded campaign. I ran for
Absolutely.
office in 2010, as you recall, and I didn't have the funding that my opponent did. But at the end of the day, the people spoke, and it was a close race, but they chose my opponent over me. And I look at that and say, well, that was the process at work. I wouldn't have ever said, oh, the election was rigged, or, it's all so unfair, or the system is broken, or anything like that. I just said, hey, the people spoke. I had 28,500 votes. That was pretty good in a 78,000 voter turnout, and or 78,000 voters in the district. But we had very high turnout that year in 2010. But what I look back on most of all was a sense of pride in being able to say, well, I was part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't trying to attack the process. I was trying to hijack the process by being a candidate. And people asked me, why didn't I vote in the previous election? And I said, because I was being cowardly. And then I decided if I don't like who's running, I should run. And so I did. But now I can say I've gotten my feet wet, even though I lost, and I participated in my government, even to the extent of losing an election. When you hear those words as a young person, how does that strike you? And how do you think that would strike your friends and colleagues, the ones you have respect for?
I think that it strikes me as what democracy should look like. A true democratic act is to say, if I don't like the candidates, I'll run myself. I think that that's very patriotic, and it's the right way to go about things. And I think that most of my peers would agree. But there's also other levels to it that are, I could bring up this idea that there absolutely would be people who are my peers saying that you shouldn't run because you are a privileged white male, and that, the road should be given to, it should be paved more so for other people to kind of step up. And that's not what I believe, but
I find that
it's part of
fascinating,
the
though,
rhetoric.
because that
for
really
sure.
is a thing. You and I have discussed this for hours and hours and hours at home. This idea of white privilege and white guilt and things like that. And I've told you over and over again that my great fantasy for the world is that we outgrow any and all considerations based on race. And you've told me in return that I'm being unrealistic. Do I have that right?
It's too far in the future. Yeah, it is unrealistic because we are still so closely tied to many generations of racial division, racial hierarchy, putting the white man at the top of that hierarchy. That this idea that we can just say, "Oh well, we're just going to act like our society still isn't functioning off of all of these divisions and oppressions and systematic and systemic racism," or that when you see a highly melanated woman in a hijab, that you don't have some sort of perception about that woman's life. That to say that that's not true and that social division isn't real is just, it's too far in a utopian future society.
Well, you grew up watching Star Trek.
Mhm.
Every night we'd watch an episode of Star Trek reruns before we put you to bed. How did that affect your worldview, if at all?
Well, Captain Janeway being a female captain was really cool to me. Or Chakotay having a tattoo on his face and him being her first man was pretty cool
First
to me.
officer.
Her first officer. Yeah, I mean, it was really a good thing to grow up on, for sure.
And we know the first interracial kiss on television was the original Star Trek with Nichelle Nichols and William Shatner.
Mm-hmm.
And so Star Trek's always been a way paver in terms of forward thought. But, there was a space station on Deep Space Nine, and the commander of that was Benjamin Sisko, an African-American man. And more importantly to me, a bald man. And I really like the fact that they've had two bald leaders on Star Trek, because I like to joke about being bald. Anyway, you have to own it or grow some hair. When we look at the idea of a future that isn't preoccupied with trying to out-hate the other man, How do we get there? You said it's going to get worse before it gets better, but how do we get there? We can't give up.
I think that, like I said, that education is such a necessity for a well-rounded society, making it accessible, reliable, all the things that we would want it to be is the first step in doing anything productive, moving forward. Because if you are not educated in what you're talking about or who you're voting for, like you said, really knowing who it is that you're voting for, you're just going to keep running yourself deeper into that loop, into the gimmick. You're just going to keep running yourself down those ruts that you're creating, and then sooner or later the society is going to fall apart because nobody knows where to go, nobody knows where it came from, nobody knows what another option is. And that is an extreme to say that nobody does, but the amount of people who are struggling to think for themselves and figure out the truth and come from a place of education and the desire to not say, well, I have these opinions, this is how I grew up, these are my values, and so this is what I believe, and this is just the group that I'm going to put myself with to make it easier for myself, and so I can absolve myself from any sort of responsibility to my society. That we'll get stuck there for sure.
I think often about the quote from John F. Kennedy, who said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask rather what you can do for your country."
Exactly.
It seems that there are fewer and fewer people in the world today, to me as a 61-year-old old fart, that really embrace that idea. Does it seem that way from your point of view?
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's a lot of moments that I find myself wondering about something politically or some social topic that's being brought up, and the answer is go read or Google it is the sort of thing that happens where it's even with the protesting that's going on, or this, what some might think is anti-American hate, that you think that America is bad. It's really like how can we make our society better? But we definitely lose sight of how we can participate in democracy, like posting something on the internet versus getting out in your community and running for a legislative position.
I suspect one day I'll do it again, but for now I'm busy trying to make a living and writing books. One of the things that I focus on as a parent is trying to make sure that you get every possible exposure that is within the bounds of safety. Do you happen to remember where you learned how to walk?
Yes.
You've heard the story as you've gotten older. Do you actually remember it?
Bits and pieces, yeah.
Tell the audience where you learned how to walk.
At a drop zone hangar where my dad and his friends would skydive and pack their parachutes.
And we were there every weekend, all through your childhood, because I was on a competition team. Do you think you'll ever jump out of an airplane?
Maybe.
And your sister already has.
I don't have the strong urge to skydive that some people do.
All right. Well, Katie, I always enjoyed talking to you. When you were little, all you did was yell at me. And now that you're a true adult and an impressive one at that, thank you so much for turning out the way you did, and thank you so much for being on Viewpoint today.
Thanks for having me.